Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Andrew Robinson.
And I'm Emiliano Cacciatoro, and this is Leather and Loom.
Yep, and today we're going to talk to you about why Rolex owns the crown in watchmaking.
Yeah, and why it just sits on top of everybody else in a lot of ways. One is marketing, one is production and mass appeal. And this kind of all started because prior to this, I asked Andrew if you
Yep.
were to be stopped on the street and somebody would be like, "Hey, why would you pay $10,000, $20,000 for a Rolex or more?" Um, in 2 minutes, could you explain to them why it matters or why they should care about the quality and the product that they're
Yeah,
getting?
it's like a 2 minute knock on the door pitch for
Yeah,
Rolex,
an elevator pitch
an elevator
for
pitch to
Rolex.
Rolex. And what I said was, I think storytelling is why Rolex is the king. And we've mapped out kind of chronologically some examples.
Yeah.
We're not going to be perfect, but we'll bounce around
So bear with us.
some examples of storytelling about Rolex and what made them go from this small brand. Because mind you, Rolex even today is not a high horology brand. They're not people think Rolex.
No, they're not like the ultra luxuries like
They're not.
Pateks or Epijorns, like
But if you ask one person on the street, name one watch brand, what are they going to
or
tell you?
one nice watch brand, they'll tell you Rolex.
They'll tell you Rolex. So, ladies and
Yep.
gentlemen, let's dive into it with a couple examples. So, I think the first big example is probably Mercedes Gleitz trying to cross the English Channel.
In the late 20s, correct?
Late 20s.
Yep.
Yeah, she was a professional swimmer at the time, and Hans Wilsdorf, the founder of Rolex, was
An
like,
English woman.
yeah, uh, he was like, oh my god, like I can give my brand new Oyster Perpetual watch, this waterproof rotor based watch that will spin and then power the watch as long as you wear it. Let's prove 2 points here in this. My perpetual watch will continue to run, and it's waterproof, and that's
And
exactly what it did.
and how did he market it prior to giving it to her?
Oh well, right after he was. Oh, right
Or
before.
yeah.
Okay, so in his store, he would take this Oyster Perpetual watch. He would grab fish bowls and then put the fish bowls in front of the glass wall in front of the store as you're walking by on the street, and people would look by and be like, "Is that a watch inside of a fish bowl?"
Yeah, and then you'd see it's functioning and you could pull it out. It wasn't a gimmick or display or there wasn't it was a water in the 1920s. Sorry, it was a watch in the 1920s fully submerged in water.
And you have to think how weird it is at the time. Back in the day, watches
Or
were
pocket
not
watches.
were not popular. It was a pocket watch.
Yeah.
Men becoming men, they would wear a pocket watch, and then ladies would wear a wristwatch.
And
So
they
you,
were small, dainty things, like very, very small,
yeah,
because they were heavy. I mean, technology, and you weren't able to make high quality material that small.
the reason why wristwatches became popular in the first place is because of World War I. Soldiers needed the time and sync themselves to charging out of the trench.
And pilots,
And
they
pilots,
know they're all the fuel calculations were based on the Cartier Santos was one of the very first pilot
the
watches.
first, the first,
Yeah,
yeah, Louis Cartier made a wristwatch for his friend because he was having a hard time checking his pocket watch while he was mid-flight. So
in a biplane, that thing could fall out the top.
every example I can think of a watch that I find interesting is because it has an interesting story to it.
Absolutely, and that's what we are, Leather and Loom. We try to be storytellers, and that's why we vintage
Well,
watches
look
appeal
at
to us.
going back to Rolex, the Rolex Explorer.
One of the very first ones to have significant stories.
Sir Edmund Hillary was given a watch by Hans Wilsdorf, the founder of Rolex. Probably not him himself, but he was given this Rolex, and he was like, "Hey, man, I would love for you to wear this watch and then summit Mount Everest with it." Sir Edmund Hillary was an Englishman, and he had a bias towards the English folks. So he wore. A lot of people believe he wore a Smith's watch up to the summit of Mount Everest, and not a Rolex. But
Mm,
despite that, Rolex owns the narrative, right? So
yeah.
if Sir Edmund Hillary put that thing in his backpack, Hans Wilsdorf doesn't care. He's like, hey,
How many
then
how many marketing campaigns did he run? Did Rolex run with it dealing with climbing Mount Everest? Like there's a punch.
it's
You can find very cool vintage posters of it.
look at if you go on Rolex right now and you click on the Explorer on their website, what do you see in the background of the Explorer? It's ice,
Mm.
and
That's
it's
a
a black
homage.
dial watch,
Yeah.
and it's these subtle hints to these history. Whether Sir Edmund Hillary wore the Explorer or not, Hans Wilsdorf doesn't care about that. He cares about the narrative that he can say that they did, and no one can prove him otherwise.
Yeah, and you see that going through. everything. After, so we were just kind of talking in the 50s, then you go into the 60s, and what is something that he captures, or not Hans Wildorf per se, but Rolex captures, is the attention of pop culture with the permeation of Rolex through
James
cinema.
Bond.
Yeah, cinema and books. Ian Fleming's wrote
James Bond.
James Bond with a Rolex. What is it, Explorer?
He
And then
wrote.
in the movies, it was a Submariner,
Why do you think he chose the Explorer?
because it was just a clean looking watch.
At the time? He was writing these books 10 years after, 10ish years after someone climbed and summited Mount Everest wearing it. So he was like, "Oh, that's a tough guy watch." So you look at the early 2000s, like people are like panterize the tough guy watch, this big watch, but back in the day, it was like this Explorer is like the
All
pinnacle
steel, yeah.
of tough guy watches. So what does James Bond need to wear? It's like this Rolex Explorer. As we shift in culture a little bit, like now we're looking at the Submariner, this waterproof watch, this dive watch that James Bond is wearing in cinema. And yeah, my first experience of Rolex in general was I was in the Philippines and I was deployed there, and I was on a cot just watching James Bond films, and I was like,
Doctor No
I was
or the
watching
newer
Doctor
ones?
No and
Yeah.
Goldfinger, and I was like, oh well, hell, this is the cool watch. So, but even beyond cinema, if you've never seen a James Bond film, you catch somebody on the street and they
Yeah.
know Rolex.
Or you've seen someone on your Instagram feed, or someone playing at Wimbledon wearing a Rolex. I mean, they're everywhere. I'm actually surprised. One of the big things is they lost the space race to
Oh yeah,
Omega.
that
You
is
know,
correct.
which is crazy when you think about the things that they have done. They beat everybody on the ocean race. If you want to talk, because your first watch was a James Cameron
It was.
Deep Sea, which you haven't held one. It is a brick,
It is a
almost
brick.
literally.
Yeah, yeah. James Cameron, he's the director. He directed the Titanic, but
Avatar.
yep, Avatar. But he's also an explorer, and he prides himself in that. So he has his own submarine, and he took this lime green submarine to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, and on the outside of it, he had a Rolex Sea Dweller. And the Sea Dweller, for those of you that don't know, is just a higher depth rated submariner. It's a little bit
2,000
thicker.
meter or
Yeah, it's a little bit more,
yeah,
but Rolex made a watch for him to take and put it on the boom arm of the Submariner or of the submarine, and he did that. And he went all the way down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, and as they settled to the ground, he pointed out as the dust settled, and there it was, the
perfect time.
Rolex Sea Roller holding perfect time.
It's crazy.
So to commemorate it, they made the James Cameron dial, and you can look that up. It's a blue all the way down to a black dial to represent the depth, and then the text is that lime green.
Yeah, it's probably one of my favorite dials. Like it's, I think it's a really cool
It's
dial.
yeah, it's amazing.
But yeah, I mean, and you talk about it being able to go down to the Mariana Trench, and that is something that when you talk about Rolex, you talk about the quality of the product,
Yep.
and that is what Rolex has prided itself on for so many years, is the quality that it's providing to the customers and its quality to its reputation. It's when you see it, it's pretty impressive. So Rolex is owned by a foundation, the Hans Waldorf Foundation, which is a
Yep.
non-for-profit. And
Yes.
if it's a non-for-profit, they can reinvest. They don't have shareholder pressure.
No pressure from anybody. They own the
Yeah,
narrative, which is frustrating for a lot of watch collectors because we're always asking for that next thing from Rolex, but uh,
they're
they
super secretive
they're the
about it.
master of doing things subtle. They see
Yeah,
watch production as a marathon, not a sprint.
and keeping you at the edge of your seat for a marathon,
How brainwashed are we that we get a different color dial on a
and we
watch
freak out.
and we freak out? How crazy is that? And then we're asking so much of these high horology brands and they can't keep up. These conglomerates, LVMH, like they owe something to the watch buyers. Where Rolex, they own themselves. They own their own narrative.
It is impressive, and I think kind of what we just all talked about it. It's impressive how Rolex has been able to capture the attention for so many years. I mean, they are going on for 100 plus years right
A
now,
hundred
and
plus years, and they do it all themselves. They're steel
yeah,
foundries. They do it themselves. Back in the early 2000s, people started demanding like, hey, if I'm going to spend $10,000 for a watch, why are there third party movements inside my watch? Rolex
Zenith was making them, correct?
Zenith
Yeah,
was yeah, it was making the Rolex Daytona movement, and Rolex was one of the first ones to catch on. Like, we should probably start doing everything in house. So when they started doing that, then they're like, oh, our steel foundries, like, why don't we just produce our own steel
yeah, and
and
gold and platinum.
everything? So there's kind of this aura of like you can't touch me about it, which is kind of appealing. But I think bottom line, what we're getting at, ladies and gentlemen, is like there's a story behind this piece. It's not just when I
and behind the company.
when I put on this Cartier Santos, I like it. I love the design, but there's also like a hey, you know this is the first pilot watch. Like
Yeah.
the
No, agreed. And when I put on this two door, ironically, I was like, yeah, it's a Rolex little brother. Like,
there's
everything
always
ties
a
back to the
story.
story.
Yeah, there's something art. There's a clash, like a big bang of something that's artistic, functional, and a story driven fact. And I think that's
And
kind of
personal.
and very personal. And I think that's what's beautiful about watch collecting, and that's why I'm into it.
That's
Um,
why we got into it, and that's why we really founded Leather and Loom, to perpetuate those stories and to continue to build a platform where people can have that connection and where people can seek the stories, and then honestly, like, buy pieces to then continue their story.
yeah, I want to close it out maybe with yeah. I wear a military uniform most every day, and so do you. What can you do to really express yourself in that uniform?
Wear a great
Wear a
watch.
great watch. That's all you got. That's all you got. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, other than that and your badges, there's nothing else you can personalize.
Let's close it on this, Emiliano. What Rolex, if you were to own one, he hasn't bought one yet. What Rolex would you do, and what Rolex do you find to have the most interesting story?
So for me, it would most likely be, and not story, but appeal, and I think
Yeah,
uniqueness is a root beer. I think not a lot of people can pull off the brown and black.
I agree.
I think with the rose gold bracelet as well, it's just a beautiful watch. It's a beautiful watch that you don't see often. And the vintage root beers, the patina on them and the age, I think is so unique,
Yes.
so cool. Um, and yeah, that would be absolutely. It is in my holy grail of watches
And
is a root
then,
beer.
real quick, most interesting story of any Rolex, off the cuff.
Off the cuff would be, for me, it would be probably the Paul Newman.
Paul Newman,
It's
classic
just,
answer.
it's such a beautiful watch.
Classic answer. I love it. I'm an explorer guy, but ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, we're curating stories. We want to hear from you.
Absolutely.
This is what Leather and Loom is all about. We're telling a story, but we want to hear from you. If you have a watch story about your first watch, your 10th watch, we want to hear from you. So hit us up on Instagram, on our website at leatherloom.com. We'll tag it in the bio, but thanks
Yeah,
for tagging along with us. We got more stories in the future. Thanks.
appreciate it.
All right.